In the beginning, God spoke creation into existence. But only once in all of history did he choose to speak face to face with a mortal man as friend speaks to friend. That man was Moses, the prophet whose very countenance blazed with the glory of the Almighty. Behold, the one who heard the sacred name, I am, spoken from flames that consumed nothing, who stretched forth his hand, and the Red Sea obeyed, whose staff became the instrument of divine judgment upon nations. This is he who ascended the mountain shrouded in thunder and lightning to receive the eternal law written by the finger of God himself. Witness how the Lord prepared a deliverer from before his birth, hidden among the reeds of the Nile, raised in Pharaoh's house, yet destined to lead God's chosen people from bondage to freedom. Come and see the man who spoke with the voice of heaven and whose legacy echoes through eternity. Egypt had become a prison for God's people. The descendants of Jacob, who came as 70 people during a famine, had multiplied into a mighty nation. But this blessing became their curse. The new Pharaoh didn't know Joseph or remember how he had saved Egypt from starvation. He looked at the growing Hebrew population with fear and suspicion. Pharaoh imagined the Israelites joining his enemies in battle, fighting against Egypt from within. So he made a cruel decision as recorded in Exodus 1 verse 1. They put slave masters over them to oppress them with forced labor. And they built Pithom and Ramesses as store cities for Pharaoh. The Israelites bent under heavy loads, mixing clay and straw to make bricks. Their hands bled from making mortar. But slavery couldn't stop God's people from growing. The harder the Egyptians worked them, the more they multiplied. This terrified Pharaoh even more. He decided to attack the source, Hebrew babies. First, he secretly commanded the Hebrew midwives. As recorded in Exodus 1 verse 16, when you are helping the Hebrew women during childbirth, if you see that the baby is a boy, kill him. But if it is a girl, let her live. The midwives feared God more than Pharaoh and refused to murder innocent babies. When Pharaoh realized his plan failed, his anger exploded into an even worse command. Exodus 1 verse 22 records his decree. Then Pharaoh gave this order to all his people. Every Hebrew boy that is born, you must throw into the Nile, but let every girl live. The sacred river would become a graveyard for Hebrew children. Into this world of terror, a baby was born to a Levite woman. When she first looked at her son, something extraordinary happened. Exodus 2 verse 2 tells us, she saw that he was a fine child, and she hid him for 3 months. The Hebrew word suggests divine beauty. This child was marked as special. For 3 months, this mother lived in constant fear. Every cry could mean discovery and death. She muffled his sounds, hid him during the day, and prayed neighbors wouldn't betray them. Egyptian soldiers patrolled Hebrew neighborhoods, listening for male infants. But babies grow, and hiding became impossible. Her love sparked a desperate plan. She would trust her son to the very river Pharaoh chose as his tomb. Working quickly, she wove reeds into a basket and sealed it with tar and pitch, making it waterproof like a tiny ark. As Exodus 2 verse 3 records, she placed the child in it and put it among the reeds along the bank of the Nile. Her daughter Miriam watched from a distance. As the sun rose over the Nile, Pharaoh's daughter made her way to the river for her daily bath. Egyptian royalty often bathed during cool morning hours before the desert heat became unbearable. The princess walked with her attendants, choosing the perfect spot where water flowed gently past thick reeds along the shore. As they prepared for bathing, an attendant noticed something unusual among the reeds. There was a basket clearly handmade and carefully sealed with tar. But what was it doing here, and why was it moving slightly? The princess's curiosity was aroused. Royal women rarely encountered mysteries, and this was definitely worth investigating. The princess commanded her slave girl to retrieve the basket. As it came to shore, they heard soft crying. When they opened the lid, they discovered the most beautiful infant any had seen. His features were perfect, his cry strong and healthy. The princess knew immediately what she was looking at. As Exodus 2 verse 6 tells us, she opened it and saw the baby. He was crying, and she felt sorry for him. This is one of the Hebrew babies, she said. This was one of the male infants her father had ordered thrown into the Nile. But instead of duty to obey Pharaoh's command, compassion stirred in her heart. Here was innocence personified, a child who needed protection. At that moment, young Miriam made her move. She had been hiding, watching everything unfold. Now she summoned courage and stepped forward. A Hebrew girl approaching royalty uninvited could be killed. But Miriam risked everything for her brother. Her approach was brilliant in its simplicity. Miriam didn't reveal her connection to the baby. Instead, she offered a practical solution. As Exodus 2 verse 7 records, then his sister asked Pharaoh's daughter, "Shall I go and get one of the Hebrew women to nurse the baby for you? The princess would need someone to feed this infant." The princess agreed, and Miriam ran to find her mother. When she burst home with the news, the mother could hardly believe it. Her desperate act of faith had worked beyond imagination. Her son was alive and under royal protection. Default text. When the mother arrived, the princess made an incredible offer. According to Exodus 2 verse 9, she said, "Take this baby and nurse him for me, and I will pay you." So the Hebrew woman would raise her own son, love him openly, teach him his heritage, and receive Egyptian gold. God had turned Pharaoh's cruel law into the instrument of Moses' salvation. When Moses was weaned, he entered Pharaoh's palace permanently. His mother had taught him everything possible during those precious early years, stories of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, God's promises to their descendants, and his true Hebrew identity. The palace was overwhelming for a young boy. Gold-covered walls, precious stones, decorated surfaces. But Pharaoh's daughter welcomed him warmly and gave him a name that would echo through history. As Exodus 2 verse 10 explains, she named him Moses, saying, "I drew him out of the water." The name came from Egyptian words meaning to draw out, unknowingly prophesying his future role. Moses received the finest education available. Egyptian princes were trained to rule provinces, lead armies, and manage construction projects. They studied mathematics, geometry, astronomy, and hieroglyphic writing. Moses learned strategy, tactics, sword fighting, and archery. Egyptian warfare involved chariots, infantry, and naval forces. The royal court provided leadership training. Moses observed how Pharaoh governed Egypt, dealt with ambassadors, and managed bureaucracy. He learned to speak with authority, make decisions, and project confidence. These skills would serve him when he later confronted Pharaoh demanding Hebrew freedom. Moses also studied Egyptian religion and philosophy in temple schools. He understood beliefs about gods, goddesses, the afterlife, and Pharaoh's divine status. This knowledge proved invaluable when he later confronted Egyptian religious systems with demonstrations of God's power. Yet Moses never forgot his Hebrew identity. His mother had planted truth seeds that Egyptian wisdom couldn't uproot. He knew his people suffered while he enjoyed privilege. This created growing tension that would eventually explode into action. Acts 7 verse 22 tells us, Moses was educated in all the wisdom of the Egyptians and was powerful in speech and action. He became a respected leader in court, possibly leading military campaigns. But success couldn't satisfy his heart's deeper longings. Every day he saw Hebrew slaves laboring while he relaxed in palace comfort. Every night he slept on fine linen while his people collapsed from exhaustion. The contrast haunted him, creating internal conflict that grew stronger yearly. As he approached 40, this tension reached a breaking point. At 40, Moses had reached peak success in Egyptian society. He was educated, powerful, and respected throughout Pharaoh's court. But inside, a storm was building. He could no longer ignore his people's suffering while enjoying Egyptian luxury. His Hebrew heritage, planted by his mother, had grown into conviction, demanding action. Moses made a life-changing decision. He would leave palace comfort and see what was really happening to Hebrew slaves. This wasn't casual observation or official inspection. This was a man wrestling with conscience, trying to understand where he belonged in a world divided between oppressor and oppressed. When Moses walked among work sites, what he saw shattered illusions about Egyptian treatment of Hebrews. These weren't just laborers. They were people being systematically broken by cruel systems designed to destroy spirits and bodies. Hebrew men stumbled under impossible loads. Women worked in blazing sun without adequate water. Children carried supplies instead of playing. Hebrew workers were thin from inadequate food, their skin scarred from beatings, eyes hollow with despair. Many showed malnutrition and exhaustion. Some collapsed from heat and overwork only to be kicked back to their feet. The Israelites weren't just slaves. They were being slowly murdered through deliberate cruelty. Egyptian taskmasters walked among workers with whips and clubs, ready to strike anyone moving slowly. They showed no mercy for age or weakness. Old men were beaten for not keeping up. Pregnant women carried heavy loads. The sick received no recovery time, only more work and punishment. Moses felt emotions he'd never experienced. Rage burned at injustice. Shame filled his heart for years of comfort while this happened. Guilt overwhelmed him for benefiting from the system destroying his people. His Egyptian education and Hebrew heritage were in violent conflict. Then Moses witnessed something that ignited an unquenchable fire in his soul. He saw an Egyptian taskmaster savagely beating a Hebrew worker with shocking brutality. This wasn't discipline. This was torture for pleasure. The Hebrew was defenseless, weakened by hunger and exhaustion, unable to fight back or escape. As Acts 7 verses 23 to 24 describes, when Moses was 40 years old, he decided to visit his own people, the Israelites. He saw one of them being mistreated by an Egyptian, so he went to his defense and avenged him by killing the Egyptian. 40 years of conflict exploded into action. Moses looked around quickly, heart pounding with righteous anger. The beating occurred in a remote area where slaves dug clay for bricks away from main construction sites. No other Egyptian supervisors were visible. Hebrew workers focused on survival, avoiding attention. This appeared to be his chance to act without immediate consequences. His calculation was swift but thorough. Moses had military training and physical power. The taskmaster focused entirely on his victim, unaware anyone might challenge his authority. Egyptian overseers expected absolute power over Hebrew slaves. It wouldn't occur to this man that someone might fight back. Moses decided instantly. All his accumulated rage, guilt over privilege, and shame at his people's suffering exploded into action. He struck with the full force of training and fury. The Egyptian never had a chance to defend himself. As Exodus 2 verses 11 to 12 records, he saw an Egyptian beating a Hebrew, one of his own people. Looking this way and that and seeing no one, he killed the Egyptian and hid him in the sand. The silence was deafening. For the first time, an Egyptian oppressor lay dead at Hebrew hands. The beating had stopped forever. Justice was served, though through violence. Moses felt satisfaction and horror mixed. He'd never killed before, but felt no regret for stopping his people's torture. Now came the practical problem: what to do with the body. If discovered, investigations would begin immediately. Moses knew Egyptian justice was swift and brutal. His identity as Pharaoh's adopted grandson might not protect him if the king learned he'd killed an Egyptian to save a Hebrew slave. Working quickly, Moses dug in the sandy soil. The same desert sand covering Egypt would become a grave. He dug frantically, constantly watching for approaching people. Hebrew workers maintained distance, probably too terrified to interfere or acknowledge what they'd witnessed. Being connected to a dead Egyptian meant death for all. Moses convinced himself his secret was safe. The remote location, the absence of witnesses, the fear keeping Hebrew workers silent. Everything favored his escape from consequences. He covered the grave carefully, scattering sand to look natural. When finished, no sign remained. Moses returned to the palace that evening, carrying an unknown burden. For the first time, he was a wanted man, even if unknown yet. But he'd crossed an uncrossable line. The Egyptian prince was dying. Moses, the Hebrew, was being born. He'd chosen his side in the conflict between oppressor and oppressed. The next morning, Moses carried his secret like a physical burden. Perhaps he hoped his action had sent a message to other taskmasters about treating Hebrew workers more humanely. Or maybe he wanted to see if his intervention made any difference in his people's daily suffering. Whatever his motivation, Moses returned to the work sites. Walking among the workers, Moses discovered something both surprising and troubling. Instead of seeing his people united in suffering, he witnessed two Hebrew men in violent combat. This wasn't a casual disagreement. This was serious fighting, with one clearly overpowering the other. The sight disturbed Moses profoundly. Why were his people fighting each other when they faced such powerful enemies? Why use strength against themselves instead of preserving it for survival? Didn't they understand their real battle was against the Egyptian system oppressing them all? Moses decided to intervene as a peacemaker. His royal education taught diplomacy and conflict resolution. His sense of justice demanded stopping unnecessary violence wherever found. Approaching the obvious aggressor, Moses attempted to reason with him to end the fight before serious injury occurred. But the man's response hit Moses like a physical blow. Instead of accepting correction or showing respect for Moses' intervention, he lashed out with words shattering Moses' security. As Exodus 2 verses 13 to 14 records the devastating exchange, the man said, "Who made you ruler and judge over us? Are you thinking of killing me as you killed the Egyptian?" The words hung like accusations from heaven. Moses' carefully hidden secret was out. Someone had seen everything: his approach to the taskmaster, the violent confrontation, the hasty burial. Worse, the knowledge was spreading among the Hebrew workers. If this man knew about the killing, how many others had heard? The verse continues with Moses' reaction. Then Moses was afraid and thought, "What I did must have become known." For the first time since childhood, real fear gripped his heart. Not the excitement of challenges or the nervousness of decisions, but cold, paralyzing terror at the prospect of discovery and execution. Moses realized his situation assessment was completely wrong. He thought he acted secretly, but the Hebrew workers watched everything. They'd been too frightened to interfere during the killing, but they had certainly witnessed it. Now, They were talking among themselves, sharing the story of the Egyptian prince who killed an overseer to save a Hebrew slave. Even worse was the confronting man's attitude. Instead of gratitude for defending their people, he showed hostility and suspicion. Instead of seeing Moses as a protector, he questioned his authority and motives. The rejection stung deeply. Moses had risked everything defending his people, and this was their response: suspicion and threats of exposure. Most terrifying was what this meant for his future. If the Hebrew workers knew, how long before word reached Egyptian ears? The Hebrew community had informants reporting to authorities for better treatment or rewards. Someone would eventually trade this information for an advantage. Moses' fears proved correct faster than imagined. The news had reached Pharaoh's court with the speed gossip travels in royal circles. Perhaps a Hebrew informant traded the information for a reward, or Egyptian workers heard rumors and investigated. However it happened, the news exploded through the palace like wildfire. The king's reaction was volcanic. As Exodus 2 verse 15 tells us, when Pharaoh heard of this, he tried to kill Moses. But Moses fled from Pharaoh and went to live in Midian. Pharaoh's rage wasn't just about one dead overseer. It was the ultimate betrayal by someone trusted completely. His daughter's adopted son had chosen Hebrew slaves over Egyptian authority. The betrayal cut deeper because of Moses' position in the court. He wasn't just any Hebrew who killed an Egyptian. He was an Egyptian prince who turned against the system that elevated him. In Pharaoh's eyes, this made Moses' crime infinitely worse than murder. It was high treason, deserving the most painful death Egyptian justice could devise. Moses had no time to gather possessions, say goodbyes, or prepare for travel. Royal guards were probably already searching for him. He had to run immediately, taking only what he wore and could carry. Behind lay 40 years of luxury, education, and position. Ahead lay an unknown wilderness and an uncertain future, including possible death from thirst, starvation, or wild animals. The irony wasn't lost on Moses as he fled the Egyptian countryside. The same education preparing him to lead Egyptian armies now helped him plan escape routes, avoiding capture. His geographical knowledge told him which roads to avoid and which paths led to safety. Military training taught him movement without detection and survival with minimal resources. Moses probably headed east toward the Sinai Peninsula and the desert regions where Egyptian authority was weakest. This was harsh territory. Few could survive without extensive preparation, but it was also the most likely place to escape Pharaoh's reach. Nomadic tribes wandered these areas, and a man might disappear completely if he proved useful. The journey was brutal, beyond anything Moses had experienced. The man who dined on royal delicacies now searched desperately for anything edible. His feet, accustomed to palace sandals, blistered and bled on the rocky terrain. The blazing desert sun burned his skin during the days, while the cold nights left him shivering without adequate clothing or shelter. Water was the constant, desperate need. In the palace, Moses enjoyed cool drinks whenever he wanted. Now he had to find oases, springs, or wells, always aware that other travelers might fight him for access. Dehydration was a constant threat, and every day without adequate water brought him closer to death. As he walked deeper into the wilderness, Moses had plenty of time to think about what his life had become. In 2 days, he'd lost everything: family, home, future, identity. The Egyptian prince was dead and buried with the taskmaster. Moses, the Hebrew, was being born through suffering and hardship never imagined. But something else happened during this terrible journey that Moses couldn't understand. The same God who preserved him as a baby was now guiding him toward his true destiny. Every wilderness step was also a step toward the calling that would make him the greatest Hebrew leader. After days of grueling travel, Moses finally reached the borders of Midian. After days of grueling wilderness travel, Moses approached the first sign of civilization since fleeing Egypt. In the distance, he saw a well surrounded by stone walls, the heart of any desert community. Wells were gathering places where locals drew water, shared news, and conducted business. They were also places where strangers might find help if they proved trustworthy. As Moses drew closer, exhausted and desperate for water, he witnessed a scene immediately reminding him why he'd fled Egypt. 7 young women had arrived with their father's flock, ready to draw water for the thirsty animals, but they were being harassed and driven away by rough local shepherds wanting to use the well first for their own animals. The scene was all too familiar, the strong oppressing the weak, bullies using force to take what didn't belong to them. These shepherds probably thought they could intimidate the young women and take the needed water, forcing the girls to wait until later when the well might run dry. It was the same injustice Moses witnessed in Egypt, just on a smaller scale. The shepherds had misjudged the situation. They had no idea a former Egyptian prince was watching their behavior with growing anger. Moses had lost his palace, but not his sense of justice or his willingness to defend the helpless. His royal education and military training were about to serve these young women very well. Moses didn't hesitate or try negotiating. His training taught him that bullies only understood strength, and recent experiences had stripped away any diplomatic inclinations. As Exodus 2 verse 17 describes, some shepherds came along and drove them away. But Moses got up and came to their rescue and watered their flock. The confrontation was swift and decisive. Moses was strong, confident, and skilled in combat techniques the local shepherds had never encountered. His Egyptian court military training served him well against men used to facing only frightened young women. The bullying shepherds quickly realized they picked a fight with someone far more dangerous than anticipated. Moses not only drove off the harassing shepherds, but also took on the hard physical labor of drawing water for all the women's animals. This was backbreaking work under the desert sun, requiring strength and endurance. Each bucket had to be pulled from the deep well and poured into stone troughs for the sheep and goats to drink. When the women returned home much earlier than usual, their father immediately noticed something was different. The daily well trips typically took much longer, especially when the local shepherds caused problems. As recorded in Exodus 2 verses 18 to 19, when asked why they returned early, they answered, "An Egyptian rescued us from the shepherds. He even drew water for us and watered the flock." Their father's name was Reuel, also called Jethro, a priest in Midian and a man of wisdom and honor. He understood immediately the significance of what had happened. A stranger had shown extraordinary kindness to his daughters, defending them from harassment and helping with their work. Such generosity couldn't go unrewarded. Jethro's response revealed his character and the values he taught his daughters. According to verse 20, he asked them, "And where is he? Why did you leave him? Invite him to have something to eat." In desert culture, hospitality to strangers was both a sacred duty and a practical necessity. When Moses accepted the invitation and joined Jethro's family for a meal, the priest was impressed by what he saw. Here was a man of obvious education and refinement, yet willing to work with his hands and defend the helpless. His story of fleeing Egypt for defending Hebrew slaves only increased Jethro's respect. The meeting between Moses and Jethro began a relationship that would shape both their lives. Jethro was so impressed that he made an extraordinary offer. As Exodus 2 verse 21 tells us, Moses agreed to stay with the man, who gave his daughter Zipporah to Moses in marriage. Moses had found a new family, a new home, and a new identity. The fugitive prince had become a shepherd, about to begin the education that would prepare him to lead God's people to freedom. Moses settled into a completely different life in the wilderness of Midian. The man who once wore royal robes now dressed in simple shepherd's clothing. The prince who commanded servants now tended sheep and goats under the desert sun. Days began before dawn as he led Jethro's flocks to find pasture and water in the harsh landscape. The work was demanding but peaceful. Moses learned to read the desert like a book, where to find water during the dry seasons, which plants were safe for the animals to eat, how to protect the flock from wild beasts and sudden storms. His hands, once soft from palace luxury, became calloused from handling ropes and staffs. His feet grew tough from walking the rocky terrain. Every day brought new lessons in patience. The sheep moved slowly and often wandered away from the group. Moses learned to gently guide them back rather than force them. He discovered that leadership in the wilderness meant serving the needs of those under his care, making sure each animal had enough food and water before he rested. The solitude gave Moses time to think about his past and wonder about his future. Far from Egyptian politics and Hebrew suffering, he discovered a different kind of wisdom in that desolate place. The desert taught him humility, forcing him to recognize that he was just one man in a vast, unforgiving wilderness, utterly dependent on God's provision for survival. The profound silence of the desert taught him to listen intently, to discern the subtle sounds that might warn of danger or lead him to a precious source of water. The years slipped by almost unnoticed. Moses married Zipporah, and together they built a family, their laughter echoing in the canyons. He became an integral part of Jethro's family, absorbing his father-in-law's wisdom and life experience. Jethro, a priest who knew God intimately, engaged Moses in deep conversations that expanded his understanding of the divine nature. Slowly, imperceptibly, the angry young man who had once taken a life in a fit of rage transformed into a patient, thoughtful shepherd, a guardian of his flock. Moses developed a deep affection for the desert, despite its inherent harshness. He came to know every winding trail, every hidden watering hole, every subtle seasonal change that painted the landscape in different hues. The wilderness that had initially seemed like a form of punishment became his most effective teacher, shaping him and molding him. He honed the very skills that would later prove indispensable when he led hundreds of thousands of people through those same unforgiving desert regions. The Egyptian prince was truly gone, his past life fading into a distant memory. Moses had become someone entirely new, a man of humility, patience, and unwavering dependence on God rather than his own limited strength. He likely believed his days of leadership were over, resigned to spending the remainder of his life quietly tending sheep, content with his simple existence. But God had far grander plans in store for him, preparing him for the most significant assignment any man had ever been given. As the 40th year of his exile drew to a close, Moses remained blissfully unaware that his true life's work was about to begin. The shepherd who had painstakingly learned to guide sheep through the treacherous wilderness was now ready to guide God's chosen people to freedom, leading them out of bondage and into the promised land. One ordinary morning, Moses set out with Jethro's flock, a task he had performed countless times before, a familiar ritual. But this day was destined to be unlike any other he had ever experienced. He was leading the sheep toward Mount Horeb, also known as Mount Sinai, a place he knew intimately from his years of shepherding. The mountain offered a good grazing area, with scattered vegetation that could sustain the animals. As Moses guided the flock along the well-worn paths, his mind was occupied with the mundane concerns of a shepherd's life: where to find the most nutritious grass, how long to stay in each area before the vegetation was depleted, when to move on in search of water. His routine was so ingrained that he could almost perform it on autopilot, his body moving through the motions without conscious thought. The sheep knew him well and trusted his leadership implicitly. They followed his voice, the familiar sound of his commands, and the reassuring rhythm of his staff as it tapped against the rocks. But as they approached the mountain, something unusual caught Moses' attention, causing him to stop abruptly in his tracks. In the distance, he saw what appeared to be a bush engulfed in flames. This sight wasn't entirely uncommon in the arid desert environment. Dry vegetation frequently ignited, sparked by lightning strikes or the intense desert heat. What was truly extraordinary, however, was that this particular bush seemed to be burning continuously, yet it remained miraculously intact, untouched by the destructive power of the fire. Moses watched carefully, his brow furrowed in concentration, fully expecting the flames to gradually die down as the bush was consumed, reduced to ashes. But the fire continued to burn with unwavering intensity, and the bush remained completely undamaged. The leaves weren't shriveling or browning, the branches weren't turning to ash and crumbling away, and the fire showed no signs of spreading to the surrounding vegetation, threatening to ignite the entire area. It was as if the flames were burning without actually consuming anything, a paradox that defied all natural laws. His curiosity was piqued, his mind buzzing with questions. In his 40 years of solitary desert life, Moses had witnessed many strange and wondrous things: mirages shimmering on the horizon, unusual weather patterns that defied explanation, rare and elusive wildlife that roamed the remote areas. But he had never encountered anything quite like this burning bush that refused to be consumed, a living testament to the impossible. As Exodus 3 verse 3 records his thoughts, Moses reasoned, "I will go over and see this strange sight, why the bush does not burn up." Driven by an insatiable curiosity, Moses secured his flock in a safe area where they could graze peacefully, undisturbed by whatever was about to unfold. Sheep were easily frightened by unexpected sights or sounds, prone to panic and stampede, so he made sure they were settled and comfortable before venturing further. He gripped his shepherd's staff tightly and began walking slowly and deliberately toward the mysterious bush, his mind racing with possible explanations for what he was seeing, desperately trying to reconcile the impossible with the reality before his eyes. As he drew closer, the phenomenon became even more remarkable, defying all logic and reason. The flames were undeniably real. He could see them dancing and flickering just like any normal fire, casting an eerie glow on the surrounding landscape. But the bush itself remained completely unharmed, showing absolutely no signs of damage whatsoever. Every leaf remained vibrant and green. Every branch stayed strong and healthy, defying the destructive power of the flames. The fire seemed to exist independently of the bush, a separate entity that was somehow coexisting without causing harm. It appeared to be consuming, yet it wasn't. Moses approached slowly, his heart pounding in his chest, driven by a mixture of wonder and caution in equal measure. He had no idea that he was about to have an encounter that would not only transform his own life, but would also irrevocably alter the destiny of an entire nation, setting in motion a chain of events that would reverberate throughout history. The simple shepherd, accustomed to the quiet solitude of the desert, was walking unknowingly toward a meeting with the Almighty God of the universe, the creator of all things. As Moses drew nearer to the burning bush, the mystery only deepened, defying all attempts at rational explanation. The flames continued dancing before his eyes, an ethereal display of light and heat, but the bush remained completely untouched, a testament to a power beyond human comprehension. He had witnessed many wonders during his years in the wilderness, but nothing had prepared him for this supernatural sight, this blatant disregard for the natural order. He moved closer, drawn by an irresistible force, fascinated by what appeared to be utterly impossible, a violation of the laws of nature. Suddenly, without warning, a voice spoke from the heart of the flames, shattering the silence of the desert. It wasn't the crackling sound of fire, the familiar whisper of wind through leaves, or any other natural sound. This was a clear, unmistakable voice, resonant and powerful, speaking directly to him, penetrating his very being. As Exodus 3 verse 4 records, when the Lord saw that he had gone over to look, God called to him from within the bush, "Moses, Moses." And Moses, startled but composed, responded immediately, "Here I am." The voice knew his name, echoing through the vast emptiness of the desert. After 40 years of anonymity in the wilderness, of being known only as a nameless shepherd, someone was calling him by name, acknowledging his existence. Moses responded immediately, his reply a testament to the same readiness to serve that had characterized his life as a shepherd, always attentive to the needs of his flock. But he had no idea that he was speaking to the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God of his ancestors, the God who had made a covenant with his people. Then came words that changed everything, words that resonated with power and authority, a command that stopped Moses in his tracks, paralyzing him with awe. As recorded in Exodus 3 verse 5, "Do not come any closer," God commanded, his voice echoing through the desert. "Take off your sandals, for the place where you are standing is holy ground." Moses was standing on sacred soil, in the very presence of the Almighty, surrounded by the unearthly glow of the burning bush. The command was clear and urgent, brooking no argument or delay. Moses immediately bent down, his movements deliberate and respectful, and removed his sandals, his hands probably trembling as he realized he was experiencing something far beyond the realm of normal human experience, a moment that would forever alter the course of his life. The rocky ground beneath his bare feet was holy, sanctified by the presence of God himself. The burning bush wasn't just a strange natural phenomenon, a bizarre occurrence in the desert landscape. It was a meeting place between heaven and earth, a point of intersection between the divine and the mortal. Moses likely prostrated himself before the bush, overwhelmed by the profound awareness that he was in the presence of divine holiness, a feeling of unworthiness washing over him. The voice that spoke from the flames carried absolute authority and power, resonating with a force that shook him to his core. This wasn't a dream or a vision, a figment of his imagination. This was reality, more real than anything Moses had ever experienced, a direct encounter with the living God. The fire continued burning without consuming the bush, serving as a visible sign of God's presence, a tangible manifestation of his power and glory. Fire had always been associated with the divine, a symbol of power, purity, and transformation. It provided light in darkness, warmth in cold, and the power to transform raw materials into something new. But this fire was different, defying all earthly definitions. It burned without destroying, giving light without casting shadows, radiating presence without causing fear, an embodiment of God's unwavering love and power. As Moses knelt barefoot before the burning bush, his head bowed in reverence, he waited with bated breath for whatever would come next, his heart pounding in his chest. The God who had seemed silent for 4 decades, a distant and unknowable entity, was suddenly speaking directly to him, engaging in a personal and intimate conversation. The shepherd who thought his life of significance was over, relegated to a quiet existence in the wilderness, was about to learn that his greatest work was just beginning, that he had been chosen for a purpose far grander than he could ever have imagined. The voice from the burning bush continued speaking, and Moses slowly began to understand that he was in the presence of the God his ancestors had worshipped, the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob. As Exodus 3 verse 6 records, "Then he said, I am the God of your father, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob." At this, Moses hid his face, overwhelmed with a sense of awe and reverence. He was afraid to look at God, understanding instinctively that no mortal could gaze upon the face of the Almighty and live. This wasn't the terror of facing an enemy, the fear of physical harm, but the awe of a finite being encountering infinite majesty, the recognition of his own insignificance in the face of divine power. He covered his face with his hands, his fingers trembling, understanding instinctively that no mortal could look directly upon divine glory and survive the encounter. The God who had made covenants with his forefathers, promising to bless them and their descendants, was now speaking to him personally, entrusting him with a mission of paramount importance. God began explaining why he had appeared to Moses in this extraordinary way. He had seen the suffering of his people in Egypt, the relentless oppression and the backbreaking labor, and he had heard their cries for help, their desperate pleas for deliverance. The time had come for their liberation, and Moses would be the instrument of their rescue, the chosen leader who would lead them out of bondage and into freedom. But Moses needed to know exactly who was sending him on this seemingly impossible mission, who was entrusting him with such a monumental task. When Moses asked about God's identity, he received an answer unlike anything he had ever heard, a revelation that would define his relationship with the divine. As Exodus 3 verses 13 to 14 records the conversation, Moses said to God, "Suppose I go to the Israelites and say to them, 'The God of your fathers has sent me to you,' and they ask me, 'What is his name?' Then what shall I tell them?" God responded to Moses with a declaration of profound significance. "I am who I am. This is what you are to say to the Israelites. I am has sent me to you." The name was revolutionary in its simplicity and profound in its meaning, encapsulating the very essence of God's being. "I am who I am," declared God's eternal, self-existent nature. He wasn't dependent on anything or anyone else for his existence. He was the uncaused cause, the source of all creation. He simply was, is, and always would be, existing outside the constraints of time and space. This wasn't just a name, a label to identify him. It was a revelation of divine character, a glimpse into the very heart of God. Other gods of ancient times were often associated with specific places, peoples, or natural forces, limited by their earthly connections. But the God speaking to Moses transcended all limitations, existing independently of creation, time, and circumstance. His being wasn't derived from anything else. He was the source of all existence, the foundation upon which everything else was built. God continued the revelation by connecting this eternal name to his historical relationship with Moses' people, reinforcing his commitment to their well-being. As Exodus 3 verse 15 records, God also said to Moses, "Say to the Israelites, 'The Lord, the God of your fathers, the God of Abraham, the God of Isaac, and the God of Jacob, has sent me to you. This is my name forever, the name you shall call me from generation to generation.'" The eternal I Am was also the covenant-keeping God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the God who had made promises to their ancestors and was now acting to fulfill them. He wasn't a distant, uninvolved deity, indifferent to the plight of his people, but the God who had made promises to Moses' ancestors and was now acting decisively to fulfill them. His eternal nature guaranteed that his promises were absolutely reliable, unbreakable bonds that would stand a test of time. Moses now understood exactly who was commissioning him, who was entrusting him with this monumental task. Not a tribal god or a natural force, but the self-existent creator of the universe, the source of all power and authority. The God who needed nothing but chose to involve himself in human affairs, intervening in the lives of his people. The eternal being who had bound himself by covenant to care for Abraham's descendants, ensuring their protection and prosperity. After revealing his identity, God gave Moses a mission that seemed utterly impossible, a task that defied all human logic and reason. The Lord had seen the misery of his people in Egypt, the brutal oppression and the daily indignities they suffered, and he had heard their cries for deliverance, their desperate pleas for freedom. Now he was ready to act, and Moses would be his chosen instrument, the leader who would guide them out of bondage. As Exodus 3 verses 7 to 8 records God's declaration, "I have indeed seen the misery of my people in Egypt. I have heard them crying out because of their slave drivers, and I am concerned about their suffering. So I have come down to rescue them from the hand of the Egyptians and to bring them up out of that land to a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey." The assignment was breathtaking in its scope, a challenge that would test the limits of human endurance. Moses wasn't being asked to help a few individuals escape slavery. to facilitate a small act of rebellion. He was being commissioned to liberate an entire nation from the most powerful empire on earth, to lead them to freedom and establish them in a land of their own. The Israelites numbered in the hundreds of thousands, and they had been enslaved for generations, their spirits crushed by years of oppression. How could one man, a solitary shepherd in the wilderness, possibly accomplish such a daunting task? God's command was direct and uncompromising, leaving no room for doubt or hesitation, as recorded in Exodus 3 verse 10. So now go. I am sending you to Pharaoh to bring my people, the Israelites, out of Egypt. Moses was to return to the very place he had fled from 40 years earlier, to confront the king who wanted him dead, and to demand the release of the Hebrew slaves, knowing that his request would be met with fierce resistance. The mission seemed impossible from every angle, a suicide mission that defied all logic and reason. Moses was a fugitive, with a death sentence hanging over his head, a wanted man in the eyes of the Egyptian authorities. Pharaoh would never willingly release millions of free workers, the very backbone of his empire, who built his cities and monuments and contributed to his vast wealth. The Egyptian army was the most powerful military force in the world, renowned for its discipline and its ruthlessness. How could Moses possibly succeed against such overwhelming odds, armed with nothing but a shepherd's staff and the word of God? But God wasn't asking Moses to accomplish this task in his own strength, relying on his own limited abilities. The Lord who had appeared in the burning bush, the creator of the universe, would be with him every step of the way, providing him with the power and the guidance he needed to overcome any obstacle. The eternal I Am, who had created the universe, would provide the power needed to humble mighty Egypt and free his people, demonstrating his supremacy over all earthly powers. Moses was also promised that this liberation wouldn't be temporary or partial, a fleeting moment of freedom followed by a return to bondage. God intended to bring the Israelites to a land of their own, a good and spacious land, a land flowing with milk and honey, a place of abundance and prosperity. This was the same land he had promised to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob, the inheritance that had been promised to their descendants. The mission wasn't just about escape from slavery, but about establishing God's people in their promised inheritance, fulfilling the ancient covenant. The magnitude of the assignment was staggering, a challenge that would define the course of human history. Moses would become the leader of the greatest liberation movement in human history, a symbol of hope for oppressed people everywhere. He would confront supernatural powers, witness miraculous interventions, and guide millions of people from slavery to freedom, a journey that would test his faith and his leadership at every turn. The shepherd, who had spent 40 years in obscurity, tending his flock in the quiet solitude of the desert, was being called to center stage of divine history, thrust into a role that would forever change his life and the lives of countless others. Yet, God's call was not optional, a mere suggestion or a polite invitation. This wasn't an invitation Moses could politely decline, choosing to remain in his comfortable existence. The Lord of the universe had chosen him for this task, and divine election came with divine enabling, the assurance that he would be equipped for the task ahead. The same God who spoke worlds into existence, who created the heavens and the earth, would provide everything Moses needed to fulfill his calling, empowering him to overcome any obstacle and accomplish the seemingly impossible. Moses was stunned by the enormity of God's assignment, overwhelmed by the weight of responsibility that had been placed upon his shoulders. The idea of returning to Egypt, the land of his exile, and confronting Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world, filled him with dread. After 40 years of peaceful shepherd life, far removed from the intrigues of court and the dangers of political life, he felt completely unprepared for such a massive responsibility, lacking the skills and the experience necessary to lead a nation. His immediate response was to question his own qualifications for the task, doubting his ability to fulfill such a monumental calling. As Exodus 3 verse 11 records Moses' first objection, "Who am I that I should go to Pharaoh and bring the Israelites out of Egypt?" Moses saw himself as a nobody, a fugitive shepherd who had been forgotten by history, an insignificant figure in the grand scheme of things. How could someone like him, a man with a troubled past and a humble present, stand before the most powerful ruler on earth and make demands, challenging his authority and threatening his empire? God's answer was simple but profound, a reassuring promise that transcended all human limitations. According to Exodus 3 verse 12, "I will be with you," God declared, his voice resonating with power and authority. "And this will be the sign to you that it is I who have sent you. When you have brought the people out of Egypt, you will worship God on this mountain." Moses' qualifications weren't important, his past failures were irrelevant. God's presence was everything, the key to unlocking his potential and empowering him to accomplish the impossible. But Moses wasn't satisfied with that answer, his mind racing ahead to the practical problems he would face when trying to convince the Israelites to follow him, to trust in his leadership after so many years of silence. Why should they believe that the God of their fathers had really appeared to a shepherd in the wilderness, entrusting him with their deliverance? As Exodus 4 verse 1 records his second objection, Moses answered, "What if they do not believe me or listen to me and say, 'The Lord did not appear to you'?" Moses had good reason for this concern, his doubts rooted in the reality of the situation. He had been away from Egypt for 40 years, a lifetime in those days. The Israelites might not even remember him, his face fading into a distant memory, and they certainly had no reason to trust him, a man who had abandoned them to their fate. They had probably given up hope of deliverance, resigned to their lives of servitude, and might be suspicious of anyone claiming divine authority, fearing that it was a trap. Moses then voiced his deepest personal fear about the mission, the fear that gnawed at his confidence and paralyzed him with doubt. He believed he lacked the speaking ability necessary to persuade both Pharaoh, the stubborn and unyielding ruler of Egypt, and the Israelites, who had grown accustomed to their bondage. As Exodus 4 verse 10 records his protest, Moses said to the Lord, "Pardon your servant, Lord. I have never been eloquent, neither in the past nor since you have spoken to your servant. I am slow of speech and tongue." This objection revealed how much Moses had changed during his 40 years in the wilderness, how the solitude and the hardships had shaped him and molded him into a different person. The prince, who had once been powerful in speech and action, a man of influence and authority, according to Acts 7 verse 22, now saw himself as inadequate for public speaking, lacking the charisma and the eloquence to inspire and persuade. The desert had taught him humility, stripping him of his pride and his self-confidence, but perhaps it had taught him too much humility for the task ahead, making him doubt his own abilities. God's response showed both patience and mild frustration with Moses' lack of faith, a gentle rebuke that reminded him of the source of his power. As Exodus 4 verses 11 to 12 records, the Lord said to him, "Who gave human beings their mouths? Who makes them deaf or mute? Who gives them sight or makes them blind? Is it not I, the Lord? Now go, I will help you speak and will teach you what to say." The Creator who designed human speech, who fashioned the very instruments of communication, could certainly enable Moses to speak effectively, giving him the words he needed to fulfill his mission. God wasn't asking Moses to rely on his natural abilities, his own limited resources, but on divine empowerment, the unlimited power of the Creator. Yet, Moses still resisted the calling, clinging to his fears and his doubts, showing that even direct encounters with God don't automatically eliminate human anxieties and insecurities. Moses made one final desperate attempt to avoid the assignment, a plea born out of fear and a reluctance to embrace the unknown. As Exodus 4 verse 13 records his last objection, "Pardon your servant, Lord. Please send someone else." This was no longer about qualifications or practical concerns, about a lack of skills or a fear of failure. Moses simply didn't want the responsibility, the burden of leadership that God had placed upon him. God understood that Moses needed tangible proof of divine power to overcome his fears and convince others of his divine commission, something more than just words to validate his calling. Words alone wouldn't be enough to persuade skeptical Israelites or stubborn Egyptian officials. They needed to see the power of God at work. The Lord was about to demonstrate his supernatural authority through miraculous signs, irrefutable evidence that would silence all doubts and confirm his divine purpose. The first sign involved Moses' shepherd's staff, a simple wooden rod he used to guide sheep and defend them against wild animals, a tool that represented his humble existence. God asked him what he held in his hand, prompting him to acknowledge the ordinariness of the object. And when Moses identified it as a staff, the Lord commanded him to throw it on the ground, transforming it into something extraordinary. As Exodus 4 verse 3 records, "Then the Lord said, 'Throw it on the ground.' Moses threw it on the ground, and it became a snake, and he ran from it, recoiling in fear. The transformation was instant and complete, defying all natural laws. The lifeless piece of wood became a living serpent, writhing and hissing on the ground. Moses' natural reaction was to jump back in fear, his instincts taking over. He had spent enough time in the desert to know that snakes could be deadly, representing danger and potential harm. But this was no ordinary reptile. It was a demonstration of God's power to bring life from lifeless objects, to transform the ordinary into the extraordinary. God then commanded Moses to pick up the snake by its tail, something no wise person would do with a dangerous serpent, risking a venomous bite. As Exodus 4 verse 4 records, "Then the Lord said to him, 'Reach out your hand and take it by the tail.' So Moses reached out and took hold of the snake, and it turned back into a staff in his hands, restoring it to its original form. The snake instantly became an ordinary staff again, the transformation reversing as quickly as it had occurred. This sign would prove especially powerful in Egypt, where serpents were symbols of royal authority and divine power, representing the pharaoh's control over life and death. Pharaoh's crown featured a cobra, and Egyptian magicians used snakes in their religious ceremonies, demonstrating their connection to the divine realm. When Moses' staff became a serpent, it would demonstrate that the God of Israel was superior to Egyptian gods, challenging their authority and revealing their impotence. God provided a second miraculous sign for Moses to use when needed, a further demonstration of his power and his unwavering support. As Exodus 4 verses 6 to 7 records, "Then the Lord said, 'Put your hand inside your cloak.' So Moses put his hand into his cloak, and when he took it out, the skin was leprous. It had become as white as snow. 'Now put it back into your cloak,' he said. So Moses put his hand back into his cloak, and when he took it out, it was restored like the rest of his flesh, returning it to its original state. This sign demonstrated God's power over disease and health, his ability to inflict suffering and to heal miraculously. Leprosy was one of the most feared conditions in the ancient world, a debilitating disease that caused social isolation and certain death, leaving its victims ostracized and alone. For Moses' hand to become leprous instantly and then be completely healed showed divine control over life and death, sickness and health, a power that surpassed all human understanding. God promised that if people didn't believe the first two signs, if they remained skeptical despite the overwhelming evidence, a third sign would convince them, leaving no room for doubt. As Exodus 4 verses 8 to 9 records, "If they do not believe you or pay attention to the first sign, they may believe the second. But if they do not believe these two signs or listen to you, take some water from the Nile and pour it on the dry ground. The water you take from the river will become blood on the ground." This third sign would be particularly meaningful to Egyptians, who worshiped the Nile as a source of life and prosperity, recognizing its vital role in their agriculture and their economy. To see sacred Nile water turn to blood would demonstrate that the God of Israel had power over Egypt's most important natural resource, challenging their belief system and revealing their dependence on a power beyond their control. These signs weren't just impressive displays of supernatural power, designed to awe and impress. They were carefully chosen demonstrations of God's authority over the very things Egyptians considered sacred, the foundation of their society and their religion: serpents, health, and the Nile River. Each sign challenged a core belief and revealed the power of the God of Israel. Moses now possessed irrefutable proof that the eternal I Am had the power to fulfill his promises, to deliver his people from bondage and establish them in their promised land. Despite the miraculous signs God had provided, tangible evidence of his power and his commitment, Moses remained reluctant to accept the mission, his doubts lingering in the back of his mind. His fear of public speaking continued to paralyze him with doubt, preventing him from fully embracing the task ahead. He still couldn't imagine himself standing before Pharaoh, the most powerful ruler in the world, and eloquently demanding the release of the Hebrew slaves, his confidence shaken by years of solitude. His 40 years in the wilderness had made him feel inadequate for such a crucial role, unprepared to face the challenges that lay ahead. God's patience with Moses' objections was reaching its limit, his frustration evident in his tone. As Exodus 4 verse 14 records, "Then the Lord's anger burned against Moses, and he said, 'What about your brother Aaron the Levite? I know he can speak well. He's already on his way to meet you, and he will be glad to see you.'" Moses wasn't the only one God could use to accomplish his purposes. He had other instruments at his disposal, ready and willing to serve. The mention of Aaron was surprising and encouraging, a glimmer of hope in the face of his overwhelming fear. Moses hadn't seen his older brother for 40 years, not since fleeing Egypt as a fugitive, fearing for his life. Aaron had remained in Egypt all this time, probably continuing to live among the Hebrew slaves, enduring the same hardships and oppression. Yet God had been preparing him for this moment, shaping him and molding him for his role in the liberation mission, and he was already traveling toward their reunion, guided by divine providence. God explained how the partnership between the brothers would work, outlining their respective roles and responsibilities. As Exodus 4 verses 15 to 16 records, You shall speak to him and put words in his mouth. I will help both of you speak and will teach you what to do. He will speak to the people for you, and it will be as if he were your mouth and as if you were God to him. Aaron would be Moses' spokesman, acting as his voice before Pharaoh and the Israelites, but Moses would remain the leader, receiving direct communication from God. This arrangement addressed Moses' concerns about eloquence while maintaining his role as God's chosen leader, ensuring that his divine commission remained intact. Aaron would have the speaking ability Moses felt he lacked, the charisma and the eloquence to persuade and inspire, but Moses would receive direct communication from God, the source of all wisdom and power, and give Aaron the words to speak, guiding him with divine knowledge. It was a perfect solution that used both brothers' strengths, combining their unique abilities to create an effective team. The staff that had become a serpent, a symbol of divine power and authority, would remain in Moses' hands, a visible sign of his calling. As Exodus 4 verse 17 records, "But take this staff in your hand so you can perform the signs with it," reminding him of the power he possessed. The miraculous powers wouldn't be transferred to Aaron, but would remain with Moses, the chosen leader. God had orchestrated events so that Aaron was already traveling to meet Moses, probably in response to divine guidance he had received, ensuring that their reunion would occur at the appointed time. The reunion between the brothers would be emotional and significant, a moment of reconciliation and renewed commitment. Aaron would learn about Moses' encounter with God, hearing firsthand about the burning bush and the divine commission, and accept his role in the liberation mission, embracing the responsibility with unwavering faith. The appointment of Aaron as spokesman solved Moses' final objection and established the leadership structure for Israel's exodus from Egypt, paving the way for their liberation. Moses would be the prophet who received direct revelation from God, the intermediary between the divine and the human, while Aaron would be the priest who communicated with the people, acting as their voice and their representative. Together, they would form an effective team, a united front capable of confronting Pharaoh and leading the Israelites to freedom, fulfilling God's divine purpose. With all his objections answered and practical arrangements made, Moses could no longer avoid his divine calling, his doubts silenced by the overwhelming evidence of God's power and his unwavering support. The burning bush encounter was complete, the initial meeting drawing to a close, but the real work was just beginning, the arduous task of leading a nation out of bondage. The shepherd was about to become the deliverer, the leader who would guide his people to freedom, and the quiet wilderness was about to give way to the greatest liberation story in human history, a tale that would be told for generations to come. Moses left his peaceful life in Midian, his quiet existence as a shepherd, and began the journey back to Egypt with his wife and children, leaving behind the familiar comforts of his adopted home. The land he was returning to held painful memories, scars from his past mistakes. It was where he had killed an Egyptian and fled for his life 40 years earlier, haunted by the guilt of his actions. But now he carried God's commission, the weight of divine responsibility, and the promise of divine presence, knowing that he was not alone. As he traveled the familiar desert routes, retracing his steps from decades ago, he must have wondered how the Israelites would receive him after so many years of absence, what their reaction would be to his return. The first priority was reuniting with his brother Aaron, who had been traveling to meet him as God had promised, guided by divine providence. When the brothers saw each other after 4 decades of separation, their emotions must have been overwhelming, a mixture of joy, relief, and anticipation. Apart from that initial meeting, it was a deeply emotional reunion. Moses poured out everything that had transpired at the burning bush, from God's dramatic appearance to the revelation of his sacred name, and finally, the urgent mission to wrench Israel free from the clutches of slavery. Aaron, his brother, hung on every word, especially as Moses detailed the miraculous signs God had entrusted to him. He spoke of the shepherd's staff, how it could transform into a slithering serpent, the hand that could become riddled with leprosy and then miraculously heal, and the chilling promise of water turning into blood. These weren't cheap parlor tricks, mind you. They were concrete proof that the God of Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob was fully committed to acting on behalf of his people. Together, the brothers ventured into Egypt, their first task to seek out the Hebrew elders. These were the leaders who had managed to maintain some semblance of authority amidst the Israelite slaves, even under the relentless Egyptian oppression. Moses and Aaron knew they needed the elders' backing before they could even think of approaching Pharaoh, because these elders represented the voice, the very soul, of the people. The elders, carefully chosen for their wisdom and influence, gathered to hear what Moses and Aaron had to say. There stood Moses, a figure some might vaguely remember as the Egyptian prince who had vanished after killing a taskmaster. Now, he was back, standing before them, proclaiming that God himself had appeared to him and given him the divine task of leading them out of slavery. It was, to say the least, a mind-blowing story, but they understandably needed some sort of confirmation. As Exodus 4 verses 30 to 31 vividly recounts, what happened next was nothing short of astonishing. Aaron relayed everything the Lord had spoken to Moses, leaving no detail untouched. Then, he dramatically performed the signs right before their very eyes. And the people, witnessing these incredible acts, believed. Hearing that the Lord was deeply aware of their plight and had witnessed their unbearable misery, they bowed down in humble reverence and worshipped. The miraculous signs weren't just impressive, they were utterly convincing. The elders, who had endured generations of suffering, were now witnessing proof that God was indeed with Moses and Aaron. The staff, turning into a serpent, was a stark visual echo of what had occurred at the burning bush. Moses' hand, horrifically afflicted with leprosy and then instantly restored, was another undeniable sign of divine power. But more than just the spectacle, the message itself resonated deep within them, sparking a flicker of hope they hadn't dared to feel in ages. God had, at long last, seen their suffering. He had undeniably heard their desperate cries for help, and now he was ready to deliver them from the iron grip of Egyptian bondage. After 4 long centuries of brutal slavery, the promise made to Abraham was finally on the verge of being fulfilled. The Israelites would be set free, and they would inherit the land that God had sworn to give their ancestors. Now, armed with the unwavering support of the Hebrew elders and fueled by the undeniable power of God's miraculous signs, Moses and Aaron began preparing for their monumental first meeting with Pharaoh. This was the very moment that Moses had been dreading ever since his encounter at the burning bush. He was returning to the palace, the place where he had once lived a life of privilege as a prince, but now as a fugitive, demanding what seemed utterly impossible. The brothers approached the royal court, not as supplicants, but with the full authority of heaven backing their mission. They weren't coming as beggars or lowly petitioners, but as ambassadors of the Almighty God himself. Their message was simple, direct, and utterly uncompromising. The Lord demanded the immediate release of his people from Egyptian slavery. When they were finally granted an audience with Pharaoh, Moses and Aaron delivered God's command with unwavering boldness. As Exodus 5 verse 1 records their words, they stood before the king and declared, "This is what the Lord, the God of Israel, says, let my people go, so that they may hold a festival to me in the wilderness." This wasn't some polite request, it was a non-negotiable divine decree. Pharaoh's response instantly revealed the depth of his arrogance and his utter contempt for the God of Israel. As Exodus 5 verse 2 records his dismissive reply, Pharaoh sneered, "Who is the Lord, that I should obey him and let Israel go? I do not know the Lord, and I will not let Israel go." The king of Egypt, in his own mind, considered himself a god, and he certainly wasn't about to take orders from some foreign deity. Moses and Aaron, undeterred, tried again, carefully explaining that the God of the Hebrews had personally met with them and commanded this specific time of worship. But Pharaoh wasn't the least bit interested in religious explanations. He saw their request as a direct threat to his labor force, and, more importantly, to his own absolute authority. Why in the world would he release millions of workers who were the very backbone of his empire, the builders of his grand cities and colossal monuments? Instead of even considering their plea, Pharaoh erupted in anger at what he perceived as Moses and Aaron's meddling with his slaves. He accused them of disrupting the work and, in effect, making the people lazy. His response was as swift as it was utterly cruel. He would make the Israelites' burden even heavier, pushing them to their breaking point. Pharaoh immediately summoned his slave drivers and foremen. As Exodus 5 verses 7 to 8 chillingly records his commands, he ordered, "You are no longer to supply the people with straw for making bricks. Let them go and gather their own straw, but require them to make the same number of bricks as before. Don't reduce the quota. They are lazy. That is why they are crying out, 'Let us go and sacrifice to our God.'" This was a devastating blow to the already suffering Hebrew slaves. Straw was absolutely essential for making strong, durable bricks. It acted as a binding agent, preventing the clay from cracking and crumbling when it dried. Now, the Israelites would be forced to find their own straw, a time-consuming and back-breaking task, all while somehow maintaining the same impossible production quotas. Their already unbearable workload had just been made exponentially worse. The Israelite foreman, tasked with ensuring these impossible quotas were met, were brutally beaten when the workers inevitably fell short due to the lack of adequate materials. As Exodus 5 verse 14 grimly records, and the Israelite overseers appointed by Pharaoh's slave drivers were beaten and were asked, "Why haven't you met your quota of bricks yesterday or today?" As before, the people's suffering had only increased dramatically as a direct result of Moses and Aaron's intervention. The abject failure of their first meeting with Pharaoh left Moses deeply discouraged and the Israelites seething with anger. Instead of the promised liberation, their situation had become infinitely worse. But God wasn't finished with Pharaoh, not by a long shot. The king had stubbornly rejected the Lord's authority, and now he would be forced to witness supernatural power on a scale that would compel him to acknowledge the one true God of Israel. Moses and Aaron, undeterred, returned to Pharaoh's court. But this time, they were fully prepared for a completely different kind of confrontation. The king, they knew, wasn't going to be impressed by mere words. He wanted undeniable proof of divine power. As Exodus 7 verses 8 to 9 records God's instructions, when Pharaoh says to you, "Perform a miracle," then say to Aaron, "Take your staff and throw it down before Pharaoh, and it will become a snake." Sure enough, when Moses and Aaron appeared before the king yet again, Pharaoh, with a sneer, demanded a demonstration of their claimed divine authority. He wanted to see a miracle, something tangible, that would prove beyond any doubt that their God was real and possessed genuine power. This was exactly what God had been preparing them for. During Moses' training at the burning bush, he had witnessed the power of God firsthand. Now, Aaron stepped forward, calmly and deliberately throwing down his staff as commanded. Instantly, the lifeless wooden rod transformed into a living, breathing serpent right before the stunned eyes of everyone in the court. The transformation was immediate, undeniable, and frankly terrifying. What had moments before been just a piece of wood was now a dangerous snake, writhing and hissing menacingly on the polished palace floor. But Pharaoh, arrogant as ever, wasn't easily impressed. Egypt was renowned for its magicians and sorcerers, men who claimed to perform astonishing wonders through their mastery of secret arts. The king immediately summoned his wise men and magicians, hoping to counter this startling display of Hebrew power. As Exodus 7 verse 11 records, Pharaoh then summoned wise men and sorcerers, and the Egyptian magicians also did the same things by their secret arts. The court magicians, with dramatic flair, threw down their staffs, and, to the astonishment of the onlookers, they also became serpents. For a brief moment, it seemed as if the contest was evenly matched. Both sides had seemingly produced snakes through supernatural means. Pharaoh likely felt vindicated, believing his magicians were every bit as powerful as the God that Moses and Aaron claimed to represent. But then, something utterly extraordinary happened, something that silenced the entire court in stunned disbelief. As Exodus 7 verse 12 records the dramatic conclusion, each one threw down his staff, and it became a snake. But Aaron's staff swallowed up their staffs. The serpent born from Aaron's staff devoured all the serpents created by the Egyptian magicians, demonstrating a power that was clearly superior. This was no mere magic trick or clever illusion. Aaron's staff had not only miraculously transformed into a serpent, but that serpent had proven itself far more powerful than all the supernatural forces that Egypt could possibly muster. When the demonstration was complete, Aaron calmly picked up his staff. Somehow, it had returned to its original form after swallowing all the others. The message was crystal clear to everyone present. The God of Israel was undeniably more powerful than all the gods of Egypt combined. Whatever supernatural forces the Egyptian magicians were drawing upon, the Lord was infinitely superior to them all. This wasn't some friendly contest between equals. It was a stark demonstration of absolute divine supremacy. Yet, despite this unmistakable and awe-inspiring display of power, Pharaoh's heart remained stubbornly unmoved. As Exodus 7 verse 13 bluntly records, "Yet Pharaoh's heart became hard, and he would not listen to them, just as the Lord had said." The king, blinded by his own arrogance, stubbornly refused to acknowledge what he had just witnessed or to release the Hebrew slaves. When Pharaoh defiantly refused to release the Israelites despite the overwhelming supernatural demonstration, God began a systematic assault on Egypt, a series of escalating plagues that would humble the mighty nation and ultimately force them to acknowledge his supreme power. The plagues weren't just random disasters. They were carefully targeted judgments against specific Egyptian gods and the oppressive systems that held God's people in bondage. The first plague struck at the very heart of Egyptian civilization, the Nile River. as Exodus 7 verses 17 to 18 records God's ominous warning through Moses. This is what the Lord says. By this you will know that I am the Lord. With the staff that is in my hand, I will strike the water of the Nile, and it will be changed into blood. The fish in the Nile will die, and the river will stink. The Egyptians will not be able to drink its water. The sacred Nile, the lifeblood of Egypt, became undrinkable blood. When Aaron struck the water with his staff, the entire river system was horrifically transformed into blood. Fish died in droves. The water became a putrid, stinking mess, and the Egyptians, utterly dependent on the Nile, couldn't drink from their most precious resource. But, in a defiant act, Pharaoh's magicians managed to duplicate this plague through their secret arts. So, predictably, the king remained stubborn. The second plague brought frogs, in overwhelming and utterly disgusting numbers. As Exodus 8 verses 2 to 4 records God's threat, "If you refuse to let them go, I will send a plague of frogs on your whole country. The Nile will teem with frogs. They will come up into your palace and your bedroom and onto your bed, into the houses of your officials and on your people, and into your ovens and kneading troughs." Egypt was overrun with frogs everywhere you looked. The third plague brought gnats, an unbearable swarm that covered both people and animals. This time, however, the Egyptian magicians were utterly unable to duplicate the miracle, exposing the limits of their power. As Exodus 8 verses 18 to 19 records, but when the magicians tried to produce gnats by their secret arts, they could not. Since the gnats were on people and animals everywhere, the magicians said to Pharaoh, "This is the finger of God." But Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not listen to them. The fourth plague sent swarms of flies throughout Egypt, but God, in a clear display of favoritism, deliberately protected the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived. This undeniably demonstrated that the Lord could, and would, distinguish between his people and their oppressors. Pharaoh, beginning to feel the pressure, tentatively began to negotiate, offering compromises, but God demanded nothing less than complete and unwavering obedience. The fifth plague killed off Egyptian livestock, while, miraculously, protecting Hebrew animals. The sixth plague brought painful boils, erupting on people and animals throughout Egypt. The seventh plague sent devastating hail, a destructive storm that destroyed crops and killed anyone caught out in the open. Each plague grew progressively more severe, showing God's escalating judgment. The eighth plague brought locusts, a biblical swarm that devoured every single green plant that the hail had spared. As Exodus 10 verses 14 to 15 records, they invaded all Egypt and settled down in every area of the country in great numbers. Never before had there been such a plague of locusts, nor will there ever be again. They covered all the ground until it was black. They devoured all that was left after the hail, everything growing in the fields and the fruit on the trees. The ninth plague brought darkness, so thick it could be felt, covering the entire land of Egypt for 3 long days, while the Israelites, in stark contrast, had light in their homes. Each plague directly targeted specific Egyptian gods and relentlessly demonstrated that the Lord controlled everything they worshipped: the Nile, fertility, the sun, and life itself. Throughout these devastating plagues, Pharaoh displayed a consistent pattern of stubborn resistance, revealing both his deep-seated character and God's incredible patience. Each time disaster struck Egypt, the king would outwardly seem to soften, even considering releasing the Israelites. But when relief inevitably came, his heart would harden once again, and he would steadfastly refuse God's demands. During the plague of frogs, Pharaoh actually summoned Moses and Aaron, begging them to pray for relief. As Exodus 8 verse 8 records, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Pray to the Lord to take the frogs away from me and my people, and I will let your people go to offer sacrifices to the Lord." It seemed, for a moment, that the king was actually ready to surrender. Moses, ever willing to give him a chance, agreed to pray for the frogs to be removed, even allowing Pharaoh to choose the exact time when this would happen. When the frogs died at the precise moment Pharaoh specified, it conclusively proved that God was in complete control of the plague. But, as Exodus 8 verse 15 records, but when Pharaoh saw that there was relief, he hardened his heart and would not listen to Moses and Aaron, just as the Lord had said. This frustrating pattern repeated itself with nearly every single plague. When the flies swarmed Egypt, Pharaoh offered to let the Israelites sacrifice to God, but only within Egypt's borders. When Moses insisted that they needed to go out into the wilderness, Pharaoh reluctantly agreed, but then predictably changed his mind once the flies were gone. During the devastating plague of hail, Pharaoh seemed to finally reach his breaking point. As Exodus 9 verses 27 to 28 records his apparent confession. Then Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron. "This time I have sinned," he said to them. "The Lord is in the right, and I and my people are in the wrong. Pray to the Lord, for we have had enough thunder and hail. I will let you go. You don't have to stay any longer." Moses, once again, prayed, and the devastating hail stopped immediately. But, just as before, when the immediate danger passed, Pharaoh's heart hardened once more. As Exodus 9 verses 34 to 35 records, when Pharaoh saw that the rain and hail and thunder had stopped, he sinned again. He and his officials hardened their hearts. So Pharaoh's heart was hard, and he would not let the Israelites go, just as the Lord had said through Moses. The pattern became so predictable that Moses could easily anticipate Pharaoh's responses. The king would consistently make promises under immense pressure, only to brazenly break them when relief came. He offered partial compromises, letting only the men go or allowing them to worship within Egypt, but God demanded nothing less than complete and unwavering obedience. During the plague of locusts, even Pharaoh's own officials began pressuring him to give in, recognizing the dire consequences of his stubbornness. As Exodus 10 verse 7 records their desperate plea, Pharaoh's officials said to him, "How long will this man be a snare to us? Let the people go, so that they may worship the Lord their God. Do you not yet realize that Egypt is ruined?" Even his closest advisors could see that his continued resistance was rapidly destroying their once great nation. But Pharaoh remained stubbornly defiant, clinging to his absolute authority even as his kingdom crumbled around him. He seemed utterly incapable of admitting that he had encountered a power far greater than his own. Each successive plague should have taught him humility, but instead, it only revealed the depth of his pride and his unwavering rebellion against God. This recurring pattern of hardening was both Pharaoh's conscious choice and God's divine judgment. The king repeatedly chose to resist divine authority, and God, in turn, confirmed him in that choice as part of his grand plan to demonstrate his power to all the nations. Pharaoh's stubbornness would ultimately lead to Egypt's greatest disaster and, conversely, Israel's most miraculous deliverance. Before unleashing the final and most devastating plague upon Egypt, God established a sacred ceremony that would forever mark the night of Israel's deliverance. This wasn't merely about escaping slavery. It was about becoming God's covenant people through an act of profound faith and unwavering obedience, an act that would be remembered for all generations to come. God gave Moses meticulously detailed instructions for a ritual that would protect the Hebrew families from the coming judgment. As Exodus 12 verses 3 to 4 records the divine command, "Tell the whole community of Israel that on the 10th day of this month each man is to take a lamb for his family, one for each household. If any household is too small for a whole lamb, they must share one with their nearest neighbor, having taken into account the number of people there are. The lamb, moreover, had to meet specific requirements." As Exodus 12 verse 5 explains, "The animals you choose must be year-old males without defect, and you may take them from the sheep or the goats." This wasn't just any animal. It had to be perfect, representing the very best that each family could offer. For 4 days, each family would keep their chosen lamb, caring for it and growing increasingly attached to it. Then came the solemn moment of sacrifice. As Exodus 12 verses 6 to 7 records, "Take care of them until the 14th day of the month, when all the members of the community of Israel must slaughter them at twilight. Then they are to take some of the blood and put it on the sides and tops of the doorframes of the houses where they eat the lambs." The blood on the doorframes would serve as a visible sign of their faith and unwavering obedience. Every Hebrew family had to fully trust that this simple act would protect them from the coming judgment. They couldn't rely on their ethnicity or any past good works. Only the blood of the lamb could save them from imminent death. The meal itself was carefully prescribed, each element imbued with symbolic meaning. As Exodus 12 verses 8 to 9 records, "That same night they are to eat the meat roasted over the fire, along with bitter herbs, and bread made without yeast. Do not eat the meat raw or boiled in water, but roasted over a fire with the head, legs, and internal organs." The people were to eat in haste, dressed and fully ready for immediate departure. As Exodus 12 verse 11 explains, "This is how you are to eat it, with your cloak tucked into your belt, your sandals on your feet, and your staff in your hand. Eat it in haste. It is the Lord's Passover." They had to be prepared to leave Egypt at a moment's notice. God then explained the profound significance of the ceremony. As Exodus 12 verses 12 to 13 records, "On that same night I will pass through Egypt and strike down every firstborn, both people and animals, and I will bring judgment on all the gods of Egypt. I am the Lord. The blood will be a sign for you on the houses where you are, and when I see the blood, I will pass over you. No destructive plague will touch you when I strike Egypt. This wasn't just a one-time event, but the very beginning of an annual remembrance, a lasting testament to God's power and faithfulness. As Exodus 12 verse 14 commands, "This is a day you are to commemorate. For the generations to come you shall celebrate it as a festival to the Lord, a lasting ordinance." The Passover would forever remind future generations of God's miraculous deliverance from Egyptian bondage. That night, the night of the Passover, became the most significant night in Israel's history. As darkness fell over Egypt, Hebrew families gathered in their homes, the lamb's blood prominently marking their doorframes. They ate the prescribed meal in haste, dressed and ready to depart at a moment's notice. Outside, the Egyptian firstborn had no protection whatsoever from the coming judgment. At midnight, the angel of death passed through Egypt with devastating precision. As Exodus 12 verses 29 to 30 records the terrible fulfillment of God's warning. At midnight, the Lord struck down all the firstborn in Egypt, from the firstborn of Pharaoh, who sat on the throne, to the firstborn of the prisoner, who was in the dungeon, and the firstborn of all the livestock as well. Pharaoh and all his officials and all the Egyptians got up during the night, and there was loud wailing in Egypt, for there was not a house without someone dead. The judgment was complete and inescapable. From the opulent royal palace to the humblest prison cell, every Egyptian family mourned the loss of their firstborn son. Pharaoh's own heir died alongside the heirs of his officials and the common people alike. Even the livestock suffered, completing the destruction of Egypt's future and its accumulated wealth. But in the land of Goshen, where the Israelites lived, there was no death, no mourning, only silent gratitude. Every house marked with the lamb's blood was passed over by the destroyer. God had unequivocally kept his promise to protect those who placed their trust in the blood of the sacrificial lamb. The only difference between life and death was the simple act of faith and obedience. Pharaoh's stubborn resistance finally crumbled in the face of such devastating personal loss. The king, who had repeatedly hardened his heart against God's warnings, now broke under the unbearable weight of his own son's death. As Exodus 12 verses 31 to 32 records his urgent message to Moses during that horrific night, Pharaoh summoned Moses and Aaron and said, "Up, leave my people, you and the Israelites. Go, worship the Lord as you have requested. Take your flocks and herds as you have said, and go, and also bless me." The Egyptian people, who had watched their nation suffer through 9 devastating plagues, now desperately urged the Israelites to leave immediately, fearing further divine retribution. As Exodus 12 verse 33 records, the Egyptians urged the people to hurry and leave the country. For otherwise, they said, "We will all die." In their desperate rush to see the Israelites gone, the Egyptians willingly gave them whatever they asked for. As Exodus 12 verses 35 to 36 records, the Israelites did as Moses instructed and asked the Egyptians for articles of silver and gold and for clothing. The Lord had made the Egyptians favorably disposed toward the people, and they gave them what they asked for, so they plundered the Egyptians. The Hebrew slaves, who had entered Egypt with absolutely nothing, were now leaving with the accumulated wealth of their former oppressors. This wasn't some act of theft, but a profound act of divine justice, repayment for centuries of unpaid labor and unbearable suffering. God had promised Abraham that his descendants would leave their place of slavery with great possessions, and that ancient promise was now being gloriously fulfilled. The Israelites left Egypt that very night, after 430 long years in the land. As Exodus 12 verse 41 records, at the end of the 430 years, to the very day, all the Lord's divisions left Egypt. Their liberation wasn't gradual or partial, it was immediate and complete. Just as God had promised Moses at the burning bush, they were finally free. However, this celebration of freedom was destined to be short-lived. After the initial shock of losing his firstborn son began to subside, Pharaoh, predictably, began to bitterly regret his decision to release the Hebrew slaves. The full reality of losing millions of workers hit him hard, and his stubborn pride quickly reasserted itself. He made the fateful decision to pursue the Israelites and bring them back to Egypt by force, no matter the cost. As Exodus 14 verses 5 to 6 records Pharaoh's dramatic change of heart. When the king of Egypt was told that the people had fled, Pharaoh and his officials changed their minds about them and said, "What have we done? We have let the Israelites go and have lost their services." So he had his chariot made ready and took his army with him. The same, once invincible, Egyptian military force that had dominated the known world was now relentlessly pursuing the escaped slaves. Pharaoh assembled 600 of his best chariots, along with all the other chariots in Egypt. These weren't just mere vehicles, but deadly weapons of war, each carrying trained soldiers armed with spears, bows, and deadly intent. The Egyptian army, which had conquered nations and built a vast empire, was now laser-focused on recapturing the fleeing Hebrew refugees. Meanwhile, the Israelites had been traveling toward the wilderness, but found themselves seemingly trapped at the Red Sea. God, in his infinite wisdom, had led them to this specific location, even though it appeared to be a dead end. As Exodus 14 verses 10 to 12 records their utter terror when they saw the approaching army. As Pharaoh approached, the Israelites looked up, and there were the Egyptians marching after them. They were terrified and cried out to the Lord. They said to Moses, "Was it because there were no graves in Egypt that you brought us to the desert to die?" The people's newfound faith evaporated in the face of apparent disaster. Behind them was the most powerful army on earth, rapidly closing in. Ahead was an uncrossable sea, and on both sides loomed impassable mountains. They felt utterly trapped and abandoned, completely forgetting the miraculous plagues that had so recently secured their freedom. Moses then offered a response that would resonate throughout history. As documented in Exodus 14 verses 13 to 14, Moses addressed the people, "Do not be afraid. Stand firm, and you will witness the deliverance the Lord will bring you today. The Egyptians you see before you now, you will never see again. The Lord will fight for you. You need only remain still." God was prepared to manage this seemingly insurmountable challenge. The Lord provided Moses with precise instructions for the most extraordinary miracle performed up to that point. Exodus 14 verse 16 records the command, "Raise your staff and extend your hand over the sea to divide the water, so that the Israelites can pass through the sea on dry ground." Moses was tasked with parting the Red Sea itself by stretching his staff over the water. God unleashed a powerful east wind that persisted throughout the night, splitting the sea and creating a path of dry land flanked by walls of water. Exodus 14 verses 21 to 22 details, "Then Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and all that night the Lord drove the sea back with a strong east wind and turned it into dry land. The waters were divided, and the Israelites went through the sea on dry ground, with a wall of water on their right and on their left." The crossing was a lengthy process as over 2 million Israelites, along with their livestock and belongings, traversed the divided sea. The Egyptian army followed in hot pursuit, their chariots charging onto the exposed seabed. However, God confounded their forces, causing their chariot wheels to become mired in the muddy ground. Once the last Israelite had reached the opposite shore, Moses once again stretched out his hand, and the walls of water collapsed. Exodus 14 verses 27 to 28 recounts the destruction of the Egyptian army. Moses stretched out his hand over the sea, and at daybreak, the sea returned to its place. The Egyptians were fleeing toward it, and the Lord swept them into the sea. The water flowed back and covered the chariots and horsemen, the entire army of Pharaoh that had followed the Israelites into the sea. Not a single one of them survived. The ancient world's greatest military power was annihilated in an instant. The sea, which had provided escape for Israel, became a watery grave for their oppressors. God had fought on behalf of his people, delivering them completely from Egyptian enslavement. The elation of freedom soon gave way to anxiety as the Israelites confronted the stark reality of survival in the desert. Over 2 million people, with their livestock, were now wandering in a wilderness that could scarcely sustain a few thousand nomads. Food supplies brought from Egypt were dwindling, and sources of fresh water were scarce. The people began to realize that freedom came with its own set of difficulties. A mere 3 days into their journey, the Israelites encountered their first major crisis. They discovered water at Marah, but it proved too bitter to drink. Exodus 15 verse 24 documents their complaint. "So the people grumbled against Moses, saying, 'What are we to drink?' Moses then cried out to the Lord for assistance, and God showed him a piece of wood. When Moses tossed it into the water, it became sweet and potable. The food crisis followed soon after. As their Egyptian provisions ran out, the people began to panic. Exodus 16 verses 2 to 3 records their grumbling in the desert. The whole community grumbled against Moses and Aaron. The Israelites said to them, "If only we had died by the Lord's hand in Egypt. There we sat around pots of meat and ate all the food we wanted. But you have brought us out into this desert to starve this entire assembly to death." Despite their lack of faith, God's response was gracious. Exodus 16 verse 4 records his promise. Then the Lord said to Moses, I will rain down bread from heaven for you. The people are to go out each day and gather enough for that day. The following morning, the ground was covered with a substance the Israelites had never before seen. Exodus 16 verse 15 records Moses' explanation. It is the bread the Lord has given you to eat. They named it manna. God also provided meat when the people craved it. Numbers 11:31 records. Now a wind went out from the Lord and drove quail in from the sea. It scattered them up to 2 cubits deep all around the camp. And when they were in need of water, God caused it to flow from solid rock. Exodus 17 verse 6 records, strike the rock, and water will come out of it for the people to drink. These miraculous provisions taught Israel to rely on divine sustenance. 3 months after their departure from Egypt, the Israelites arrived at Mount Sinai, the same location where Moses had encountered the burning bush. This was not merely a rest stop, but their final destination for receiving the laws that would govern them as God's covenant people. The mountain would serve as the birthplace of their national identity. God summoned Moses up the mountain to receive instructions for the people. Exodus 19 verses 5 to 6 records the Lord's message. Now if you obey me fully and keep my covenant, then out of all nations you will be my treasured possession. Although the whole earth is mine, you will be for me a kingdom of priests and a holy nation. The people agreed to this covenant relationship. God then began preparing the mountain for his dramatic appearance. Exodus 19 verses 16 to 18 describes the scene. On the morning of the 3rd day there was thunder and lightning, with a thick cloud over the mountain and a very loud trumpet blast. Everyone in the camp trembled. Mount Sinai was covered with smoke, because the Lord descended on it in fire. The smoke billowed up from it like smoke from a furnace, and the whole mountain trembled violently. From this terrifying display of divine power, God spoke the 10 Commandments directly to all the people. These were not mere suggestions, but fundamental laws that would govern their relationship with God and with one another. Moses then ascended the mountain to receive the complete law. Exodus 24 verse 12 records God's summons. Come up to me on the mountain and stay here, and I will give you the tablets of stone with the law and commandments I have written for their instruction. For 40 days and 40 nights, God imparted to Moses detailed instructions for every aspect of Israel's life. The law encompassed everything from worship to civil government to social interactions. God inscribed the 10 Commandments on stone tablets with his own finger, underscoring their permanence and divine origin. When Moses finally descended, he carried with him a complete constitution for the new nation. While Moses was on Mount Sinai receiving God's law, the people below grew restless and impatient. 40 days seemed like an eternity, and they began to fear that Moses might never return. Their faith in both Moses and the invisible God who had delivered them from Egypt began to waver. The people approached Aaron with a request that revealed how quickly they had forgotten God's mighty acts. Exodus 32 verse 1 records their demand. When the people saw that Moses was so long in coming down from the mountain, they gathered around Aaron and said, Come, make us gods who will go before us. As for this fellow Moses who brought us up out of Egypt, we don't know what has happened to him. Aaron should have refused, but instead, he succumbed to their pressure. Exodus 32 verse 4 records his fateful decision. He took what they handed him and made it into an idol cast in the shape of a calf, fashioning it with a tool. Then they said, These are your gods, Israel, who brought you up out of Egypt. The golden calf represented everything God had forbidden. Meanwhile, on the mountain, God informed Moses of what was transpiring below. Exodus 32 verses 7 to 8 records God's anger. Then the Lord said to Moses, Go down, because your people, whom you brought up out of Egypt, have become corrupt. They have been quick to turn away from what I commanded them and have made themselves an idol cast in the shape of a calf. When Moses descended and witnessed the golden calf and the wild celebration, his anger erupted, as Exodus 32 verse 19 records. When Moses approached the camp and saw the calf and the dancing, his anger burned, and he threw the tablets out of his hands, breaking them to pieces at the foot of the mountain. The broken tablets symbolized the broken covenant between God and Israel. Following the golden calf crisis, Moses faced the monumental task of rebuilding the people's relationship with God while simultaneously managing the practical needs of over 2 million people. His role evolved to encompass both spiritual intercessor and civil judge for the emerging nation. Moses immediately positioned himself between the people and divine judgment, pleading for mercy. Exodus 32 verses 31 to 32 records his passionate intercession. So Moses went back to the Lord and said, Oh, what a great sin these people have committed. They have made themselves gods of gold. But now, please forgive their sin. But if not, then blot me out of the book you have written." Moses was willing to sacrifice his own eternal destiny to save the people from God's wrath. The daily administration of justice among so many people quickly overwhelmed Moses. Exodus 18 verse 13 describes the problem. "The next day Moses took his seat to serve as judge for the people, and they stood around him from morning till evening." He was exhausting himself trying to personally handle every case. Pharaoh, Moses' father-in-law, observed the situation and offered wise counsel. Exodus 18 verses 21 to 22 records his plan. "But select capable men from all the people, men who fear God, trustworthy men who hate dishonest gain, and appoint them as officials over thousands, hundreds, fifties, and tens. Have them serve as judges for the people at all times, but have them bring every difficult case to you." Moses implemented this judicial system, which allowed him to focus on the most important cases while ensuring justice for everyone. Moses' role as intercessor continued throughout their wilderness journey, standing before God and pleading for mercy whenever the people sinned or faced a crisis. After receiving the law at Mount Sinai, the Israelites continued their journey toward the Promised Land. They reached Kadesh Barnea, on the border of Canaan, just as God had promised. The land was finally within reach. All they had to do was trust God and march in to claim their inheritance. Moses dispatched 12 spies to scout the land. They returned with evidence of its abundance, but also with fearful reports. Numbers 13:28 records their assessment. "But the people who live there are powerful, and the cities are fortified and very large. We even saw descendants of Anak there." Two of the spies, Joshua and Caleb, attempted to inspire faith in God's power. Numbers 13:30 records Caleb's confident declaration. "Then Caleb silenced the people before Moses and said, 'We should go up and take possession of the land, for we can certainly do it.' However, the majority report carried more weight with the frightened people. The people's response was immediate and devastating. Instead of trusting the God who had delivered them from Egypt, they chose to believe the fearful report. Numbers 14:1-2 records their rebellion that night. All the members of the community raised their voices and wept aloud. All the Israelites grumbled against Moses and Aaron, and the whole assembly said to them, "If only we had died in Egypt, or in this wilderness." The divine judgment was swift and decisive. Numbers 14:28-29 records God's sentence. "So tell them, as surely as I live, declares the Lord, I will do to you the very thing I heard you say. In this wilderness your bodies will fall, every one of you 20 years old or more who was counted in the census and who has grumbled against me." The faithless generation would wander for 40 years until they died in the wilderness. During those years, Moses cultivated a relationship with God unlike any other human being in history. While the people remained at a distance from the divine presence, Moses was invited into intimate fellowship with the Almighty. The Bible describes Moses' relationship with God in unique terms. Numbers 12:7-8 records God's own testimony. "But this is not true of my servant Moses. He is faithful in all my house. With him I speak face to face, clearly and not in riddles. He sees the form of the Lord." Moses received direct, clear communication from God. This face-to-face relationship was so intense that it physically affected Moses. Exodus 34 verses 29-30 records. "When Moses came down from Mount Sinai with the 2 tablets of the covenant law in his hands, he was not aware that his face was radiant because he had spoken with the Lord. When Aaron and all the Israelites saw Moses, his face was radiant, and they were afraid to come near him." God granted Moses' request to see his glory in a way that revealed divine character. Exodus 34 verses 6-7 records this divine self-revelation. "And he passed in front of Moses, proclaiming, the Lord, the compassionate and gracious God, slow to anger, abounding in love and faithfulness, maintaining love to thousands, and forgiving wickedness, rebellion, and sin." Moses' intimacy with God made him an effective intercessor who understood God's heart. As the 40 years drew to a close, Moses knew that his time as leader was nearly over. God had told him that he would not enter the Promised Land. Moses gathered all of Israel for his final address, recorded in Deuteronomy. This was a comprehensive review of God's faithfulness and a covenant renewal for the new generation. Moses reminded the people of their journey and restated the law for settled life in Canaan. The overarching theme was love for God, expressed through obedience. Deuteronomy 6 verses 4-5 records his famous declaration, "Hear, O Israel, the Lord our God, the Lord is one. Love the Lord your God with all your heart and with all your soul and with all your strength. Moses cautioned against forgetting God in times of prosperity and blessed each tribe, prophesying about their future. His final acts included writing down the law and commanding it to be read publicly. Deuteronomy 31 verse 11 records, "When all Israel comes to appear before the Lord your God at the place he will choose, you shall read this law before them in their hearing." The time arrived for Moses to depart from the people he had led for 40 years. At 120 years old, he was still physically robust, but God had determined that his work was complete. God instructed Moses to ascend Mount Nebo, which overlooked the promised land. From the summit of the mountain, God displayed the entire land to Moses. Deuteronomy 34 verses 1 to 4 records this final vision. "Then the Lord showed him the whole land, from Gilead to Dan, all of Naphtali, the territory of Ephraim and Manasseh. Then the Lord said to him, 'This is the land I promised on oath to Abraham, Isaac, and Jacob when I said, I will give it to your descendants. I have let you see it with your eyes, but you will not cross over into it.'" Moses died there on Mount Nebo, alone with God, as Deuteronomy 34 verses 5 to 7 records his peaceful passing. And Moses the servant of the Lord died there in Moab, as the Lord had said. He buried him in Moab, in the valley opposite Beth Peor, but to this day no one knows where his grave is. Moses was 120 years old when he died, yet his eyes were not weak nor his strength gone. The Bible's final assessment underscores Moses' unparalleled relationship with God. Deuteronomy 34 verses 10 to 12 concludes, "Since then, no prophet has risen in Israel like Moses, whom the Lord knew face to face, who did all those signs and wonders the Lord sent him to do in Egypt, to Pharaoh and to all his officials and to his whole land. For no one has ever shown the mighty power or performed the awesome deeds that Moses did in the sight of all Israel." If this incredible story has inspired you, moved you, or strengthened your faith, please click that subscribe button and hit the notification bell so you never miss another amazing biblical narrative. Share this video with your friends and family. Everyone should know about the man who walked closer to God than anyone else in history. And remember, the God of Moses is still the same yesterday, today, and forever. He is still looking for people who will say, "Here I am, send me," just like Moses did at the burning bush. Who knows? Your story with God might be just beginning. Thanks for joining me on this incredible journey through the life of Moses, the man closest to God.